You know what Reagan really needed? Some chapstick. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainely Movies. As part of my Exorcist review series, today I'm going to be talking about the first film in the Exorcist franchise, 1973's supernatural horror film, The Exorcist. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all of that extra content. The Exorcist stars Blair, Ellen Burstyn, Jason Miller, and Max von Sydow, and was directed by William Friedkin. Based on William Peter Blatty's 1971 novel of the same name, it tells the story of Regan McNeil, a 12-year-old girl possessed by a demon, and the two priests who attempt to save her with an exorcism. What makes an effective horror movie? Is it the monster? Is it a relatable and sympathetic set of characters? Is it the atmosphere? Maybe it's the scares. And if that's the case, what makes a movie scary? The obvious answer is that it's not just one thing, and that it's not the same thing for each person. Although fear is a universal emotion, the causes of fear are not quite as universal. Something that terrifies one person might have no effect on the next person. Fear is a very subjective thing, often driven by personal experiences, and so the fear induced by a movie is equally as subjective. The Exorcist is frequently cited as the scariest movie ever made. Its chill-inducing qualities are exalted in thousands of reviews. It frequently tops most terrifying movie lists. I personally know several people who consider it to be the most horrifying movie they've ever seen. But again, fear is subjective, and so big, broad, declarative generalizations can sometimes work against a movie because of the expectations it instills in the minds of prospective viewers. Scariest movie of all time is quite the title to live up to. Regardless of whether you consider this to be a scary film, it certainly is an influential one. Although it was not the first movie to feature possession, or even the first to showcase an exorcism, it was the first to enter the cultural zeitgeist and really make a mark on pop culture. Used as a template by nearly every possession and exorcism film since, the tropes it helped to create and the references and imitations it spawned are nearly as pervasive as the original film. It's the quintessential exorcism movie, remembered for its shocking imagery and chilling possession sequences. And yet, there's so much more to this film. Yes, the exorcism is a big part of the movie, and central to the plot, but this is also a grief-fueled drama that's as much about its characters as it is about its demonic horrors. It's got a surprisingly simple plot, with far fewer flourishes than one might expect, but the comparative simplicity allows the movie to sink in and affect viewers in a way that something more bombastic or complex would never be able to. The Exorcist is a slow burn. Its pacing is not too unlike other films from the early 70s, but it is much, much slower than most modern horror movies, which is something that I think newcomers to the film should be prepared for. It takes a while to get going, about an hour before the more horrific elements kick into gear. The first half is devoted to introducing us to the main players, planting the seeds of the investigation, and generally making us uneasy. The slow burn setup might be a bit of an excitement detriment, but it's important for the film, helping to establish the heavy, uncomfortable atmosphere and begin ramping up the tension that eventually comes to a head later in the film. I've personally never found this movie to be scary in any sort of traditional sense, but I've always found it unsettling and extremely uncomfortable. There are definitely some very creepy moments, but it's always been the general unpleasantness that's affected me more than the intended scary aspects. Things like the discomfort of watching Regan subjected to all manner of invasive medical testing, the desperation of Chris to find help for her daughter, the grief and mental anguish that Father Karras is experiencing even before he's brought into the McNeil case. Regan's possession is terrifying to many, but me? I've always been more overwhelmed by a sense of secondhand embarrassment for her over the things she does and says throughout her ordeal. Horror isn't a genre that's usually known for good performances, but The Exorcist is certainly an exception to that trend, actually earning Oscar nominations in 3 of the 4 acting categories that year. There are a number of minor characters, most of whom are good, but it really comes down to 4 characters here: the 2 exorcising priests and the McNeils. Of these 4 cast members, Max von Sydow's performance is probably the least surprising. As the titular exorcist, Father Merrin, he's got got the smallest part and least amount of screen time of the four, but a pivotal role in the story. Jason Miller was much more of a surprise. He had a larger and arguably more interesting role as Father Karras, and was able to portray the inner turmoil of the character remarkably well. Not bad, considering he wasn't even an actor at the time, but rather a writer tapped to play the role, and earning an Oscar nomination in the process. On the McNeil family side, we've got Ellen Burstyn delivering a heart-wrenching and draining performance as the mother of a possessed child. Parental panic doesn't always play well on screen, but the desperation and pained helplessness she portrays while watching Regan go through her ordeal is tough. And then, of course, we can't forget Linda Blair as Regan. The intensity and range demanded of her would have been difficult for anyone, but knowing that she was only 13 years old, and that this was one of her first film roles ever, makes it all the more impressive. Speaking of impressive, the technical elements of this film still wow today, 50 years later. Despite the almost documentary approach to much of the story, it's still a very dynamically shot film. It captures a sense of everyday 70s realism at times, is cold and clinical at other times, and manages to be extremely cinematic at still others. That iconic shot of Father Merrin arriving at the house, with its careful framing and lighting, or the staging and use of shadows throughout the exorcism itself. But the thing that stood out to me most on this rewatch was the sound editing, which I suppose shouldn't be surprising, considering the film won one of its 2 Oscars for just that. But there's so much to appreciate about the sound here. The dramatic sonic transitions from one scene to the next help keep the audience on their toes during the first act. And then all those horrifying sounds during the medical scenes ramp up the discomfort. The incessant hum of the fluorescent lights, the loud clanging of the X-ray machine and other equipment. And of course, we can't forget about the use of sound during the exorcism and possession. The creaking, cracking, spewing, and oozing, not to mention the chilling vocalizations. Combine all that with an effectively minimalistic score and Mike Oldfield's now iconic Tubular Bells theme, and you've got a soundscape that sticks with you after the credits roll. But amazingly, that's not all this film has to offer from a technical standpoint. The special effects are still just as unsettling as ever. This was before the age of CG, so everything was done practically and in camera. There's plenty of behind-the-scenes footage and documentary specials detailing the how of these various effects, but that doesn't make them any less impressive or chilling. The projectile vomit, the head turn, the moving furniture, the levitation and stairway spider walk, even the visible breath in Regan's room. Just as impressive as the special effects are the makeup effects. Regan's demonic transformation is probably the thing that instantly springs to mind here. And with her scarred face, crusty chapped lips, impossibly colored eyes, and constant oozing, it's no wonder why. But this film features another comparatively underappreciated display of makeup magic. It's something that could easily go unnoticed by people, especially today, but even back then. So what is this makeup transformation? Max von Sydow. At the time of filming, he was 43 years old, only 10 years older than Jason Miller, who played Father Karras, but you'd never be able to guess that from the movie. The transformative old age makeup believably turns him into the 80-year-old Father Merrin. 50 years after its release, I realize there's nothing I could say about this film that hasn't already been said. No new praise or criticism that I can bestow to it, no new thematic interpretation I can offer up. In fact, The Exorcist isn't a movie that I view in just a single way anyway. There are so many interpretations, as purely a horror film, as a comment on religion and faith or good and evil, as an encapsulation of Vietnam War era anxiety and discontentment, as an allegory for puberty. I can watch this movie with those various ideas in mind and see the film slightly differently each time. Mostly, though, I see The Exorcist as an influential piece of film history. It's not a movie I ever really find myself in the mood to rewatch. This isn't a horror film striving to be a piece of entertainment, after all. But it is a movie that I can appreciate on a slightly different level every 10 years or so, when I inevitably sit down for another rewatch. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. Pro number 1 has got to be the technical elements. If there weren't so many other positive aspects of this film, I'd separate this out into a few pros, but we've got to consolidate for time's sake. William Friedkin digs into his documentarian roots for the approach to the story, but The Exorcist still retains a very cinematic quality. The lighting, the framing, the unique contraptions created to capture various camera movements in a time before Steadicam, the film is somehow even more impressive from a sonic standpoint, with its minimal use of music and maximally effective use of Foley sound effects. And speaking of effects, the practical special effects and impressive makeup are just as chilling and effective today as they were 50 years ago. The second pro is the performances. There are a handful of smaller roles in this film, but most of the performative heft comes from 4 actors. Max von Sydow dons some startlingly believable old age makeup to play the experienced exorcist Father Merrin. It's rare to find a poor von Sydow performance, so the gravitas he brings to the role isn't surprising. But a performance that was surprisingly strong was Jason Miller as Father Karras. In his first film acting role ever, this writer was tapped to play the most emotionally complex character in the film, earning an Oscar nomination for his efforts. 2 more Oscar nominations went to the McNeil family performers. Ellen Burstyn gives her all as Chris, a mother desperately trying to save her daughter. And then, of course, there's 13-year-old Linda Blair as Reagan, spewing all manner of vileness, both linguistic and bodily, in her Oscar-nominated performance. Pro number 3 is the atmosphere. Although I don't find this to be a particularly scary film, I do think that it has a very effective atmosphere for a horror movie. It takes a slow burn approach to crafting this unsettling feeling, a gradual buildup of chills and tension. The noises in the attic, the Ouija board and Captain Howdy. Then it adds discomfort into the mix as Reagan begins to change and is subjected to an array of medical testing. Unlike many other horror films, this isn't a fun movie, and it's not trying to be. It's uncomfortable, it's shocking, it's frequently off-putting. Some people may find it scary, which is great, but the distressing and uneasy atmosphere that pervades the majority of the film is enough to make it effective as a horror movie for me. On the con side, my only issues are really just minor nitpicks. I like the slow burn quality of the film, but the pacing is a little tenuous, especially early on. The Northern Iraq prologue feels especially superfluous here. Now, obviously, for anybody who's read the book or seen any of the film sequels, this prologue serves as a nice nod to Pazuzu's origins, but the actual connection is never made in this film. We get the one visual throwback to the Pazuzu statue during the exorcism, but he's never named or identified in this movie, so that prologue just feels very separate from the rest of the story here. Even though this is more of a personal preference thing, I'd be remiss not to mention all of the medical stuff in my discussion of the cons. It helps add to the atmosphere, but for me, it just makes that chunk of the film so incredibly unpleasant. I'm a biologist, so I'm not squeamish. The arterial spurting during the arteriograph doesn't bother me, but it's just the idea that this kid is being forced through all these medical procedures. And of course, the director's cut adds even more of this back into the movie. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying The Exorcist or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give The Exorcist 4 out of 5 paws. The degree of scariness will vary from person to person, but this is an undeniably influential piece of horror movie history. Packed with impressive technical elements, a set of Oscar-caliber performances, and an off-putting, unsettlingly heavy atmosphere, The Exorcist still retains its place as the quintessential exorcism film 50 years after its release. I would recommend The Exorcist to anybody looking for a slow-burn horror film. This isn't a fast-paced, action-intensive, jump-scare-filled movie, but if you want a dark, unsettling atmosphere and some creepy imagery, this will probably do the trick. I would suggest that everybody check this film out, regardless of horror preferences, for its filmmaking elements and film history significance, but I recognize that it won't be a film enjoyed by all modern audiences. If you liked The Exorcist, I would recommend The Omen. Released only a few years after The Exorcist, this is another horror film centering around a child. With its supernatural religious underpinnings, family grief storyline, and shocking moments of horror, it's another unsettling addition to the creepy kid subgenre. If you're interested in a more modern horror film, you should check out The Conjuring. This atmospheric period piece offers up a great blend of slow burn character development and genuinely chilling moments, as a haunting escalates to a case of possession. And if you want another creepy 70s film about demons, you might want to watch The Sentinel. No kids in this one, and it's a little more bombastic with its horror elements, but it's an interesting psychological supernatural horror that escalates to pretty unexpected levels. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen The Exorcist? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's your favorite movie that features an exorcism? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainely Movies, the way life should be.